Welcome to the Messy Studio, everyone. My name is Mark, and I'm an artist and an art professor. And in this video, we're going to learn from Albrecht Durer by reproducing one of his most famous drawings called Prying Hands. I'm going to select the right materials, analyze Durer's drawing methods, and see what lessons can be derived through the careful copying of his work. Lastly, I'm going to see if I can apply these lessons to a drawing of my own. Let's get started. This drawing, completed at the height of Durer's powers in 1508, was done as a preparatory study for an altarpiece that's now destroyed. But due to its incredibly meticulous and deeply sensitive rendering, it stands as a finished work in its own right, and to my mind deserves a place in the pantheon of Western achievement in the visual arts next to Michelangelo's Pietà and Rembrandt's Night Watch. I've copied this work more than once in my life, but have never tried reproducing it down to its last detail, and I'm excited to give this rather daunting challenge a try. Fortunately, a high-resolution image of this drawing is available on Wikipedia, so we can examine it up close. I'm going to leave a link to it in the description section. Part of the power of Prying Hands comes from the contrast between its atmospheric softness and extremely meticulous rendering, an unusual combination of traits. Usually drawings done on tone paper use black and white chalks, such as in this drawing by the Venetian painter Tintoretto. Here the form is suggested rather than fully rendered, and surface detail is reduced to blobs of light and shadow. Conversely, pen and ink drawings from this period are usually very sharp and graphic, with everything rendered in full relief, such as in this drawing by the Dutch engraver Hendrik Goltzius. Without taking away anything from the towering achievements of Tintoretto or Goltzius, Durer miraculously manages to blend the two approaches in this drawing of Prying Hands through a careful balance of atmosphere and detail, creating a perfect marriage of poetry and scientific rigor. Let's examine the drawing up close and get an understanding of what materials and methods were used to make it, starting with the paper. Dürer first encountered blue paper, called carta azzurrata in Italian, during his visit to Venice, and we have a number of wonderful drawings done by him on this surface. This paper, developed in Bologna in the 14th century, was widely used in northern Italy during the Renaissance, and the process for making it consists of dyeing cloth rags with either indigo or woad before turning it into paper. As a result, the paper, upon close inspection, has a subtle color complexity to it, created by the matrix of varying blue fibers. However, the paper in Prying Hands looks different than the blue paper in other Durer's works, being more uniform in color. This is because in Durer's time, blue paper had not yet made its way north. So, when Dürer returned home to Nuremberg, he had to apply a blue wash to the papers he had at hand to recreate the blue paper he was probably sorely missing. This explains why this paper retains its deep blue color, whereas many examples of carta azzurrata do not. Since indigo and woad are vegetable dyes and are not light-fast, these papers have a tendency to fade over time, becoming gray, which we see in examples of Durer's work done on this paper. Since the color in this drawing retains its vibrancy, I suspect that Durer used a more stable, mineral-based pigment to make it, lapis lazuli. If that's the case, this would be a very expensive piece of paper, even if left blank, since lapis was a semi-precious stone sourced from Afghanistan, and for centuries an ounce of lapis was equivalent to an ounce of gold. Fortunately for us, a synthetic lapis lazuli was synthesized in the 1820s, allowing us to use an inexpensive ultramarine blue pigment in our paper preparation. Looking closely at the ground, I think we can arrive at a few conclusions. First, ultramarine is a dark blue pigment, so given the general evenness of the application, the pigment was mixed with a bit of white to lighten it and to give it opacity. Second, the color varies gently, which leads me to think that it was applied in two applications, with the first coat being a little lighter and greener, and the second coat being a little darker and more blue. As for what type of paint was used to apply the ground color, I couldn't find specific technical information, but Cennini, the early Renaissance Italian painter and author of the famous technical manual El Libro dell'Arte, describes a process of tinting paper using a paint that uses animal glue for a binder, a medium which in his book is called tempera, but today is referred to as distemper. Animal glues similar to gelatin produce a quick-drying, water-resistant surface with terrific archival properties, and as a medium, Dürer must have had in his studio since it was commonly used in the preparation of painting surfaces. By the way, the book describes a process of using distemper with indigo dye to create blue surfaces. And given the slightly turquoise nature of the ground color in the drawing, that may have been used as well. The only reason why I think Dürer used ultramarine is the exceptional preservation of the original blue color, which, had Dürer used indigo, would have faded. Unfortunately, this is not something I have on hand. However, I do have a bunch of acrylic paint, and with a little trickery, I think we'll be able to come up with something comparable. The main difficulty to overcome is the relative non-absorbency and slickness of acrylic paint. The solution is to mix my ultramarine and other pigments with white acrylic gesso. This gives the paint a touch of tooth, which eliminates the problem of the washes beating up on too slick a surface. It also makes the surface more absorbent, which helps the ink washes dry evenly. As for paper, we have to think about two things: the original color and the paper texture. The color is a bit difficult to ascertain, but we can see a bit of it peeking through at the edges, and it looks to be a light tan color. This makes sense since pure white paper is a 19th century invention, and many of Dürer's other drawings are done on tan-colored paper. As for texture, this paper is relatively smooth, but not perfectly so, since these perfectly flat surfaces were also a 19th century innovation. After testing a few different papers, I arrived on this one, Canson Edition Cream. While this isn't a paper made using historical methods, it comes very close to being historically accurate in its tan color, and also happens to be widely available in stores. Furthermore, this paper is water media friendly and won't buckle when I wash over it with color. Here is how I prepared my drawing surface. First, I mixed together equal parts ultramarine blue acrylic paint and white acrylic gesso. Synthetic ultramarine blue is chemically pure and more intense than its natural counterpart, so I used a bit of raw umber to bring down the saturation. And since synthetic ultramarine also tends to lean purple, I added a little bit of yellow ochre to make the color more turquoise. Then I watered everything down so that the mix would be semi-transparent. The first coat was applied loosely and was lighter and less saturated than the color in the drawing, since I'm going to apply a second coat. For the second application, I added a little bit more ultramarine, making the color darker and more saturated, and giving the finished surface a more irregular appearance. After a few unsuccessful tries, I managed to get pretty close. About as accurate as I think I'm going to get, considering I'm copying something from a screen and don't have access to the original. By the way, I recommend making at least one other sheet for practice and to test your washes while you're working. Keep in mind that matching the exact color is far less important than matching the exact value. The color can be more or less saturated, or even something else entirely, but if you miss the value, the balance between lights and shadows will be completely different. By the way, though Dürer's intention here is to reproduce the color of the papers he saw in Venice, preparing your own drawing surfaces is a terrific way to get the exact paper color you want in a drawing. And though Dürer used this paper for wet media, the touch of tooth added by the gesso makes this kind of prepared paper excellent for dry media like charcoal or even pastel. You might be wondering what pen Dürer used to get such fine lines, and what modern substitute I'm going to use to achieve similar results. The answer to both is no pen at all. The fact is, Dürer used a fine brush, perhaps even a series of brushes, to do this drawing. Such very precise lines require a small, round watercolor brush, and while you can use one made with good quality synthetic hair, best results come from a brush made from Kolinsky red sable. Such brushes can be expensive, but if you find a small one like this one made by Escoda, this is the number 4 size, it shouldn't run you more than $40. Sable brushes are indeed pricey, but if you take care of them, they'll serve you for many years. For this drawing, however, instead of using my Escoda brushes, I'm going to use this very old sable brush that I bought in 1993, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I can't remember how little I paid for it at this point, but I'm sure it was a lot less than the Escoda, and the quality here is in no way inferior. The ink or watercolor wash used here is probably made from bone black pigment, which is slightly warmer in color than some of the other black pigments on the market. Ivory black, since it no longer uses ivory, is actually bone black, so that's what I'm going to use here. As for the white, the original must have been made of lead, but due to this pigment's extreme toxicity, it's no longer used in water-based media such as watercolor or ink. Instead, I'm going to use this tube of white gouache, which uses zinc oxide as the pigment. The color is going to be a little more blue than lead white, but should be close enough. As for the underdrawing, I need something that's easy to erase and also visible on this darker surface, so I'm going to use a white chalk pencil. Okay, let's start the copy, and as I draw, I'll share my insights into how I think Dürer worked. I have the paper tilted at a slight angle, something that's not a strict requirement. Since this drawing is not done in pen and ink, where having a tilt ensures the correct ink flow of the pen, or in full watercolor, where the tilt facilitates control over washes, the paper can be laid flat. However, I strongly recommend that you try tilting your surface. It might take a little getting used to if you haven't done it before, but you might discover an increase in dexterity since the tilt places your hand in the optimal position for hatching. I'm doing an underdrawing here in white chalk pencil, and I might as well tell you now that I made a small mistake in my choice of pencil. Chalk pencils come in a variety of densities, and this one, made by the brand's Generals, was on the denser side, making it more difficult to erase. White chalk pencils made by either Cretacolor or Carbothello are less opaque and more chalky, making them better for this underdrawing stage. The main lesson here is to test all your materials thoroughly before proceeding to your project. Still, since every mistake is a learning opportunity, I think showing where I erred in my material choices makes for a better video. While I'm going to try to get as close as possible to the original without copying it stroke for stroke, I'm using an underdrawing process that is entirely modern based on a systematic breakdown of the basic forms: boxes, cylinders, spheres, and ovoids. Not only does this allow me to think about the scale, placement, and layout of my drawing in a simple way, it also allows me to focus on the fundamental structures beneath the wrinkles, sinews, and veins on the surface. One of the more miraculous things about this drawing is that Dürer never allows surface detail to overwhelm the fundamental forms. That is to say, while we admire the multi-layered webs of hatching that define every superficial feature, we never lose the sense that we're looking at very simple volumes. This ability to never lose the forest for the trees is a quality we can also admire in the great drawings of Michelangelo, something that makes his work, despite not being so calligraphically burdensome in terms of hatching, equally challenging to copy. Before applying the wash, I created 3 dilutions of bone black watercolor, one dark, one medium, and one light. The reality is that Dürer was constantly shifting the value of his lines, so you'll have to stay on your toes and keep adjusting your mixtures. But these 3 dilutions are a good starting point, which will make mixing up the exact values much easier. Don't forget to tape a little test sheet next to your drawing to make sure your washes are just right, and that the tip of your brush is perfectly aligned to make the line thickness that you need. The next step is to do the contours. Here's where the density of the white chalk pencil started to be a problem. In retrospect, I should have lightened my construction with the needed eraser just to the point where it was barely visible, because in many places it was so strong that it interfered with my lines. The issue is that Dürer was incredibly sensitive in his contour line work, not only gently modulating the line thickness, but also the value, with lines going from thin to barely visible, to dark, sharp, and fairly wide. In a pen and ink drawing, this kind of value control is not possible, making line work easier. Here I had to constantly adjust the value to get things right, and the brightness of the white chalk was distracting. These sensitive shifts in line quality contribute greatly to the atmospheric feel of the drawing, and the lesson here is to never simply outline your drawings, but to vary your lines in thickness and value in response to what you're seeing. And in places, the contour can be lost entirely, with the value serving to reinforce the clarity of form. When teaching contour, I like to use this precept: let the drawing breathe. Meaning, don't seal off the drawing like a balloon with an unbroken line, but rather keep the contour lines open, allowing atmosphere to enter, to breathe. This is something that Dürer did very well indeed. While the contours accurately record an incredible amount of detail, let me point out 2 tricks that aid the sense of anatomical structure. Here's the first. Note that the contours are composed almost entirely of convex curves. That is to say, every line curves out, and just about every concavity is actually composed of a combination of outwardly curving lines. This, with few exceptions, is an anatomical reality that extends to the rest of the figure, and is something employed by all great figurative draftsmen, from Raphael to Eng. The second important point is that Dürer generally places darker and sharper lines around knuckles and other hard surfaces, and lighter lines on softer surfaces formed by muscles or fat. The effect is subtle, but the contrast between sharp dark lines and soft faint lines also serves to give the hands a stronger sense of anatomical structure. Now that I put in my contour lines, I'm using a kneaded eraser to eliminate the white chalk construction, a task, again, made more difficult by my poor choice of white chalk pencils. I think part of the problem is my use of gesso, which created a very grippy surface for the white chalk to stick to. On regular paper, this white chalk erases much more effectively. This General's brand white chalk pencil is actually quite good for underdrawing for oil or acrylic painting, since it's dense and relatively hard, allowing you to put down all kinds of sharp, careful details without worrying that you'll brush it away with the palm of your hand. Here, unfortunately, it was too strong and took way too much time to get rid of. Now that the contours are completed, let's talk about the most difficult aspect in this drawing, the cross-hatching. I recommend you practice a bit, especially if you've never tried cross-hatching with a brush. Here are a few strokes I recommend you try getting the hang of before tackling the entire drawing. The first is simply straight hatching in a variety of lengths and directions. I would also practice lines of different thicknesses, since Dürer frequently plays with line variation. Try to keep the distance between your hatching consistent, since that's the most important factor in making closely spaced lines read as value. Once you're comfortable with straight hatching, try your hand at rounding out your strokes like this. I would also practice connecting your C-shaped strokes, since this is something you often see Dürer doing. As with the straight strokes, try your hand working in different lengths and widths. And also try curving the strokes in different directions and combining them into S shapes. I often use Dürer as the prime example of cross-contour hatching, specifically a style I call curly hatching, a rendering method that uses relatively short, form-describing C-shaped strokes, like so. To my mind, Dürer uses two distinct kinds of curly hatching methods in this drawing. The first is when he applies hatching at slightly shifting angles like this. So the first angle might run like this. And then he'll put down another angle that might run like so. And then another angle that might run like so. Usually this is done when he's using it to describe a cylindrical form like a finger. And then the second kind is when hatching is applied in opposite directions. So our first hatching angle might run like this. And then he'll apply a hatch in the opposite direction, running like this. This is often used when applying shadows to larger, flatter planes, and can be seen on the back of the hand. In these cases, Dürer paid close attention to whether he's rendering side-facing planes or top or bottom-facing planes. So if we have a side-facing plane, like so, the angles are usually going to be more vertically oriented. So we're going to have angles running this way. And then the angle going the opposite direction is also going to be more or less vertical, like this. And then when we have a top-facing plane or a bottom-facing plane, the hatching angles are going to run flatter, more horizontal. So you're going to have hatching angles that run this way. And then going the opposite direction, also at a flatter angle. Note that in both cases, the hatching layers always intersect at acute angles, and the Dürer carefully avoids 90-degree intersections on receding planes. This is because right-angled crossing of lines creates square shapes. Which suggest a front-facing plane rather than a receding plane. Now, Dürer will occasionally apply a third or fourth layer that runs across the form, like this. These are usually short, round strokes used to carve surface detail into the planes rendered by the first two hatch angles. It's important to note that Dürer does not always use intersecting angles for each layer, and that at times will apply hatching layers in the same direction to build up value. So for example, we see this on some of the fingers, where he applies hatching layer in one direction, like this, and then, as opposed to crossing angles, we'll put down another layer. This is a technique I call single directional contour hatching, and is most visible on the back hand. This is because this kind of hatching creates a quieter texture than cross hatching. So for example, here is single directional hatching. And here is cross hatching. Right, you can see that single directional hatching is not quite as busy. And since strong texture looks close and soft texture looks farther away, using cross-contour hatching on the near hand and single directional contour hatching on the far hand makes the far hand recede into the depth, another absolutely brilliant move on the part of Dürer. The following might be controversial, but I'm going to say it anyway. Dürer is often praised as having a rigorous and exacting topographic quality. I don't agree. While his calligraphic precision, careful creative choices, and intense power of observation are awe-inspiring, he's not always robotically consistent in choosing hatch directions. The hatching in the fingers is probably the most systematic and easily understood, with hatching cross-contouring the cylindrical forms. But even there, he sometimes arbitrarily applies upward curving strokes and sometimes downward curving strokes. I suspect some of the variety of strokes can be understood as Dürer's attempt to convey the irregular nature of skin texture. But there's something else at play: artistic license to do whatever one pleases. This may frustrate some of my students, especially those who are seeking clear, easily applied systems for choosing hatch angles and stroke types. But sometimes being too systematic is detrimental. Hatching, when applied too evenly, too consistently, can have a tendency to feel mechanical, repetitive, and dull. There should always be a degree of play in art, and surprising, even contradictory choices bring a sense of variety and spontaneity to the drawing. Here's the thing: drawing, especially if you're trying to do it well, is very, very hard work. But part of what makes it so hard is that you have to take tremendous pains to make it look easy. The sudden shifts in stroke length, direction, and even rendering methods make it look like Dürer is making unpremeditated decisions and being spontaneous, even if he isn't. That light, almost playful dance of a variety of hatch marks, contrasted with very meticulous rendering, is part of the charm in this drawing, and something I'm certainly going to struggle to reproduce. That said, the main factor responsible for whether a drawing works or not is not the specific hatching method, but the value. And the values here are incredibly well controlled, with each receding finger receiving just a little bit softer hatching. Diluting the ink allowed Dürer to build up the layers very gradually, and it also allowed him to put down hatching, which, if the lines were pure black, would be very busy and harsh. Besides hatching, there are also a few areas where Dürer relies on wash. In some places, it's so subtle that it's hard to perceive, such as the shadow side of the main hand. And in some places, it's easily perceptible, like the shadows on the sleeve. In those cases, the wash has a similar effect to single directional hatching in that it produces a quieter texture. One of the benefits of working on a darker paper like this is that it makes the hatching look softer. This is important since busy textures push forward, meaning that they have a tendency to make the viewer think they're close. By limiting the contrast between the paper and the dark lines, the hatching effectively recedes, and is one of the main reasons why this drawing looks so three-dimensional. Now that I'm done hatching in black, I'm going to start in on the white. And this is where I might as well admit that I made another slight mistake in my material choice. Even though I experimented with this white gouache, and it seemed acceptable, giving me just the transparency I needed, when it came time to actually use it on the drawing, it turned out to be too transparent. The biggest issue, however, is how much it changed value when it dried, going from brilliant white when wet to a dull gray, forcing me to mix up a value that initially looked much brighter than it needed to be. Oh well, that's one more lesson for your benefit. A much more effective white is Higgins Super White ink, which is what I'm going to use in my own drawing done in Dürer's style. The hatching strategy for the white areas is similar to the areas of black, with a few significant differences. Dürer uses white like a sculptor, building up areas that are closer with more opaque white, and systematically using fainter, more transparent white as things recede in space. Overall, the hatching feels a bit less systematic in the white, with a variety of line thicknesses used all at the same place, something I think he's doing to emphasize the play on light on wrinkled, semi-transparent skin. The other interesting difference is the combination of angles used in the hatching. You may remember that I said that Dürer's diagonal hatching almost never intersects at right angles, since square intersections imply frontality. However, many of the places where Dürer uses white are actually front-facing, and there he does place hatching at right angles. Furthermore, the busy overlapping textures created through many layers of intersecting hatching help make those areas look close. The white stage was actually the most difficult aspect of the copy, and not just because of my poor choice of white. Because the paper is on the darker side, the black lines don't show so strongly, so errors are not as visible. However, the white shows very clearly on dark paper, so every line felt like it mattered. Furthermore, while the hatching in the darks was fairly simple in terms of layers, so in almost all cases it was clear what hatching direction to put down, many of the white areas had more than 3 layers of hatching, making it really hard to see the order of things. If I was to redo this copy, I would practice the white application a few times, since it's really what gives the drawing its gorgeous shimmering quality, its unique sense of depth, and a feeling that these hands are emerging from the darkness towards some kind of spiritual light. Here is my completed copy. In retrospect, I didn't quite match the color of the original. The light in my studio leans slightly yellow, which tricked me into thinking that the color I had mixed up was sufficiently turquoise. I definitely should have put more yellow into the mix and perhaps gone a little darker, but matching colors from the screen is incredibly difficult, and I think this is a passable first attempt. My advice is to copy and copy more than once. In art, mistakes are simply learning opportunities, but if no attempt is made to correct them through subsequent efforts, those lessons will not be retained. In this case, I'll try to correct my mistakes by doing an original drawing in the style of Albrecht Durer. Since this is my own drawing and not a copy, I didn't try matching the exact color of Dürer's Prying Hands, and mixed up a ground that was a touch darker and more saturated. Perhaps the ground color went a little too dark here, obscuring the darker lines, but whatever loss of contrast there is in the darker areas will be made up in the lights. The main mistake I wanted to correct was my choice of white. Instead of Winsor & Newton gouache, I switched to Higgins Super White ink. Unlike gouache, which is water-soluble and therefore correctable, this ink is waterproof and cannot be washed away. This is stressful, but you can make value adjustments to it if you go too bright by going over it with an eraser. This I did multiple times in my drawing, and I think it really helped control the values and increase the sense of depth in my drawing. What I didn't do effectively is anticipate where to place my lighter values. The fact is, most of the places where I used dark ink could have been rendered with various degrees of white, with the dark blue paper acting as the darker value underneath. This is the sort of thing I'll have to correct in a future version of this drawing. So, what overarching principles can be derived from copying Dürer? What lessons can I take with me from the process and apply to my own work? The first and most important is to maintain a balance between surface detail and underlying form. Dürer's powers of observation are incredibly acute, and he records every bump and wrinkle, every vein and sinew. And yet, despite this intense exploration of surface, he never loses sight of the large, simple forms underneath. As a result, the drawing is a brilliant interplay of delicate surface and sculptural solidity. Copying Dürer reminds me to strive for that perfect interplay between surface and volumetric structure, to never allow surface to overwhelm the form, and to never allow the form to stand naked on its own, unadorned by surface detail. The second lesson is that paper value matters. A large part of the charm of this drawing rests on the fact that this paper is a touch darker than usual, which makes the whites shimmer and gives the effect of this hand emerging from a veil of darkness. If this drawing had been on actual carta azurada, which is usually a lighter surface, I believe a great deal of the magic in this drawing would have been lost. The control over value and color that comes from preparing your own drawing surfaces is something I plan to take more advantage of in the future. The third lesson is that while the brush is not an easy instrument for line work, in some respects it's easier to work with than a pen, in that it allows you to create thick and thin lines in every direction, and because it's so easy to mix up whatever value you want, which leads directly to lesson 4. And lesson 4 is, yes, the type of hatching Dürer uses does require a lot of precision, and is something he achieved through diligent practice from an early age. But control over hatching is only one factor in what gives this drawing power, and it could be argued that it plays a relatively minimal role. Much of the power in this drawing comes from carefully manipulated value, and with this technique, where you can easily and quickly lighten or darken your lines, the control is unparalleled, and is in part what allowed Dürer to make this supremely sensitive masterpiece. And the last lesson, at least for this video, is that using multiple hatch methods is not a mistake, so long as the mix is applied consistently throughout the drawing. Dürer's Prying Hands violates one of my rules of cross-hatching, which is to pick a style of hatching and stick with it throughout the drawing. This means that if you choose to apply hatching layers in a single direction, don't suddenly switch to cross-hatching. And if you choose to cross-hatch, don't suddenly go from non-form following strokes that only indicate value to form contouring strokes. Generally speaking, switching techniques will break the unity in your drawing and will result in a mess, since cross-hatching techniques often don't work well together. However, in this and many other drawings, Dürer breaks this rule by using both single-directional and cross-contour hatching. The key here is that he consistently switches between the two techniques throughout the drawing, so that the unity is not broken. This is akin to a rule of color in painting. If you use a color in part of the painting, try to use it in other parts to maintain color unity. Here is my completed drawing. Copying Dürer, or even working in his style, is indeed a humbling experience, and many of you might be intimidated and feel that it's beyond your current abilities. I recommend you do it anyway, but start off with a more limited objective, and then gradually increase the scope of the exercise. Start with a finger, then do 2, then 3. Before you know it, you'll have a hand, and then be ready to copy the entire thing. And if the copy is not to your liking, don't worry. You will have learned a lot from the attempt, and will carry the lesson forward to your own work. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you did, please subscribe and enjoy many other videos on drawing materials and techniques, including an entire playlist dedicated to learning from the drawings of the old masters. Thanks so much for watching, and see you back in my messy studio very soon. Bye-bye.